Hey there team, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to the review. Today we're looking at Shinobi, Art of Vengeance. So I've been playing this in pre-release, I've clocked it, seen credits roll. To give you a little bit of datum, this game is a side-scrolling platformer. I wouldn't call it like a Metroidvania or anything like that, so, often in this space, something like Ori and the Blind Forest is my high watermark. It's my go-to. It's probably my favorite in this umbrella. This sits off to the side a little bit more. So it's not about back and forth. It is definitely stage driven. There are multiple stages that you move through, which is great. You got these cool set pieces and all that, but it's not one big contiguous biome. Some of the levels do get into that a little bit of back and forth and branching paths for switches and that sort of thing. But for the most part, you could probably call this a very linear game with some side areas to do some more advanced challenges, both platforming and action combat wise. So all said, it took me 8.5 hours, doing a bit of the side content as I went, not being an absolute dog with a bone, sniffing it all out like crazy. And then once I've clocked it, I've unlocked boss mode, boss rush, arcade mode, and then there's all sorts of side stuff that you can unlock and you earn in-game currency for a shop. So pretty standard fare. There's a lot more content beyond what I've gotten there, but that's the core experience. Oh, and as far as difficulty goes, I think there are 3 difficulty settings, and it's kind of framed like very easy, and normal, and I beat it on, the hardest. But all said, wonderful package. I loved every second of it. It's very much, for what it is in the space that it's in, a very perfect game, and it's one of those things, it's less about glaring weaknesses or issues, and more about you'd have to be a bit nitpicky when comparing it to things like, Ori and the Blind Forest. Yes, they are different, but Ori is much more, let's say, Metroidvania and platform heavy and challenging, whereas this has a more robust combat system. But that's my point. You start to get into your apples, oranges, your comparisons, as opposed to your overt nitpicks. So yeah, safe to say, Shinobi, excellent game, highly recommend it. I'm resurrecting my score system, and no big lectures or anything like that, other than I like doing it. It's mine, it's unique. If you're not across it, it's essentially 100 games over the course of the year, from 100 down to 1. It's sequential, it's a ranking. Don't get too hung up on it. That's kind of the point. Too many people give a shit about 7 out of 10 IGN. I would much rather give you a list, and you can use the score to see what I would recommend higher or lower than said game. So in this instance, I'm placing it on the list at 89%, which is to say sitting underneath JDM, Japanese Drift Master, which was an absolute blinder of a game. I really enjoyed it, and it took me way by surprise. But also above Tainted Grail, The Fall of Averno, which I still want to go back to and mop up some more hidden stuff. What a very cool Oblivion-esque game in a year where we also got the Oblivion remake. So it fits snugly between 2 other very high recommendations. Okay, Shinobi, Act of Vengeance. I'll give you a quick throwback as well. Shinobi, to me, I have a couple of memories, and I didn't really realize that until they came bubbling to the surface because of this game. I played the original back on the Master System, which was the precursor to the Mega Drive and the direct opposition to the NES, right, or the Famicom. So if you have Nintendo 1 and Super Nintendo, you had Master System and Mega Drive, and I think, the Americans have called it bloody Sega CD or something like that. But it was the old 2-button competition to the original Nintendo. And on that you had Shinobi, and playing this, they rattle off that the main character's name is Joe Musashi, which I remember. I remember being a kid playing Shinobi and reading that somewhere, probably in the instruction book or something, and thinking that is a very odd name for a ninja warrior type dude. So that came bubbling back. And then also I was fighting a fairly early boss battle against this kind of head on a wall, and it was sending waves and waves of what can only really be described as stacked enemies, like from top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, pushing at you. And that again sparked some ancient memory of yesteryear, and I had to go and look it up, and wouldn't you know it, it was actually a boss from the original game. So it's an homage, a reimagining of that one boss fight. Now look, look, there's probably more stuff in there, but that's for me as a kid that played this game bloody 30 years ago or something like that, or at least the original, remembering two distinct things from that. That's pretty cool. I'm sure there have been more Shinobi games since then. I don't know. I haven't followed it closely or anything like that, and there may well be a bunch of other homage, but it doesn't get in the way. But it is kind of cool to see that sort of care shown for the original source material. As far as, story goes, it's very surface level. You're Joe Musashi, the Shinobi. It would seem you're kind of like old man Batman in this, you're running a dojo, you're a master. You may even be the master of this entire Urobo clan. It's, honestly, I'm not 100% sure, but you find yourself fighting the big bad guy, and it's kind of a lot of pitched battle war stuff going on in the background. You'll be running along through open meadows, and you'll see bloody mech warriors and kaijus fighting each other in the sky behind you. It's very, very cool. The set pieces are non-stop. What a beautiful game. From top to bottom. The developer is actually Lizard Cube. It seems to have been split between Sega and Lizard Cube, and the publisher is, big man Sega stepping up to the plate, which is cool to see. I don't know who owns Dotemu. Actually, that's a lie. I think I do. Let me think about this. I think they're probably technically Embracer by about 5 steps removed. Let me think. Focus Interactive might have scooped up Dotemu. But anyway, it's a name you may have heard, and they've sort of made their name for themselves doing this kind of game, which is to say, not a straight remake or remaster. I'm looking at you, bloody Naughty Dog, with Last of Us 1, the 17th version with up-resed eyelashes or some bullshit. You watch PlayStation 6, they're going to re-release all those Last of Us again. It's kind of a great example of corporatism run wild, but if people are going to keep giving them money for these versions of these games, you can't really blame them for doing it. The market dictates at the end of the day. But I much prefer this style, which again, I'll say Dotemu, at least as the publisher and money men, move makers, have probably laid out, where you take a pre-existing franchise that probably holds up in your mind, but I doubt Shinobi 1 is much fun to play 30 years on, other than letting your nostalgia do heavy lifting and being a curmudgeon-y old man. A lot of these games were wonderful when we were 10, but not so much now. So you take that nostalgia-baited pre-existing franchise that you own the rights to, and then you make it fresh and brand new on modern hardware for current generation gamers, and then you've got something magic. Anyway, I keep banging the drum. Yes, Dotemu is not involved in this project, but they did pair up with Lizard Cube to do Streets of Rage 4, which same sort of formula. I mean, totally different genre, but the same nostalgia base, the same time period roughly, and they absolutely nailed it. So whatever Lizard Cube brought to the table, or at least learnt from that whole experience, they've brought over here, and in turn they've kind of upsized their publisher with Sega themselves. The end result is something that is super high production. It's beautiful, it's polished from the ground up. It's really hard to find any major fault with this game. It's very combat heavy, if you were to compare it to something like Ori and the Blind Forest, and you'll have to forgive me, that's my go-to touchstone. I understand that if there's an umbrella, that these two would not sit directly under it together. They'd be more, fringe. Being that Ori is much more of a Metroidvania or a Castlevania, it's more of a hardcore platformer, going back and forth, unlocking more of a persistent biome world map. This is much more stage-based, right? Very much more locomotion. In some of the less strong levels, an example comes to mind, there's one where you're on a train, so you can imagine it's much more strictly going from left to right, fighting through dudes, right? So when I say that kind of movement, that locomotion, moving through areas, that's more how Shinobi is. And it's funny that, because you would think most games that have any sort of train level, it's usually the standout set piece. I even think back to the old Uncharted 2 train set piece, and yet, arguably, that's the weakest level in this. Some of the, especially the later levels, I don't even want to mention or put footage up because they're an absolute delight. But this game plays to its advantage, the fact that it is biome hopping, right? So you get some incredible set pieces, and you also get some interim levels as well, where it'll be kind of of the era, thinking of Battletoads and that sort of stuff, riding on jet bikes and moving through a kind of filler mission. You have that here, riding on your white wolf dog thing, and there are a couple of other stuff. Again, I don't really want to spoil it, because that's one of the strengths of this, is how many cool different biome levels there are, and how it just goes wild and goes to some really weird places later in the game. So yeah, at its core, that's its construction. Much more combat heavy than some of its contemporaries. The combat is incredibly satisfying. For the most part, your skill sets are light attack, heavy attack. You can throw, little ninja star kunai things. You can charge up abilities as well and map them to hold left bumper and press a face button to use the appropriate one. And they're actually all quite situational. You can slot them in and out. There are in-game shops that you earn currency, which is pretty standard fare, and you buy these things and slot them in. But, I lent quite heavily onto one that was like an aerial, like you'd only could use it in mid-aerial, and I found myself getting pretty good at doing like a juggling rhythm against even some bosses, and it felt more like a fighting game in a way, and it was incredibly rewarding just punishing them and trying to juggle and juggle and juggle, and I could tie that super ability into that juggling combo. And you get some more generic ones. You can breathe fire on dudes and that sort of stuff. There's one that's like a counter, kind of lock up in a defensive auto parry position, and if the enemy hits you with something at that point, you counter attack and it does massive damage. So these are things that are kind of just peripheral over abilities, over damage things, but they did a bit more with them and made them a bit more utility based. Enemies will have like a health bar and a stagger bar, and if you fill the stagger bar, you can do a very stylistic, hold both bumpers to execute the dude from no matter where you are. You do like a ninja swipe across the screen. You can do multiple at once, and that's how you get health back as well. And so it's not ultra necessary, but sometimes the checkpoints can be a bit brutal and few and far between. So trying to actually beat down a dude's stagger bar and execute him to get a little bit of that health back becomes a strategy akin to something you'd see in the new Doom games. And through the course of it, the game will often lock you to a screen for a mini sort of arena fight. You can do optional ones along the way for, extra points and unlocks and that sort of stuff. For the most part, I found the difficulty to be scalable incredibly well. Not just the combat, I know I'm focusing on the combat, but the action platforming, I wouldn't say it was weak in the beginning, but it was definitely easier, both of them, and that's why I make a remark about the scaling, because often a lot of games get that wrong. A lot of games seem to forget, and it's got to be a course of, you start developing the beginning of the game at the beginning, and at the end, the more recent time is the end of the game. I know that seems like spoon-fed obvious information, but a lot of developers kind of forget that the beginning of the game still needs to be fun when your character is relatively depowered. Whether it is through combat moves or maybe they can't double jump or something like that. And a lot of game design looks a bit back to front. Your beginning character is more a shit version of the end character with his powers stripped back, as opposed to something custom built in that moment for that character. So this game nails that state. So you could be playing for the first couple of hours with very little abilities, but the game is still challenging and fun, but it's not that hard. By the end of the game, once you ramp in abilities, it's not actually really linear, but the truth is, if you were to plot it, your personal progress as you master a game and move through it is also curved and probably not linear. So the difficulty starts to really ramp, and the last few bosses are brutal, and there are some puzzle platforming things in some of the last biomes that do make me think of something like Ori and the Blind Forest, which is quite incredibly hardcore when it comes to the puzzle platforming. So yeah, in the beginning, totally consumable. By the end, brutal and well earned when you do actually break through and conquer both parts of that gameplay loop. I haven't dwelled on the art too much other than to say it's excellent and it's worth gushing over. It is so beautiful. All the animations from top to bottom. The music is excellent. In fact, what would you call it? The action boss rush stage music is some of the best I've heard in recent memory. It's an earworm that's just going to stick with me forever. The voice work's a bit funny. Your main character, Joe Musashi, is kind of memed on. He's a Gordon Freeman-esque. Side characters will talk to you and he will just go, like all he has is grunts. And it's funny and it works perfectly well. The cast of characters surrounding you are all very strong female warriors, I suppose, and they're inoffensive. I never thought anything of it until right at the end of the game. Literally, when you're about to execute the final boss, your female student decides to come out of the woodwork and lecture you on vengeance and this sort of stuff, and it's actually a bit off-putting how out of place and shoehorned in it is. Anyway, it bears mentioning because, well, it was so odd and out of place and didn't really super surprise me that much when I let the credits roll, and there is actually a DEI division of Sega that was involved in this too. But yes, that soured me a little bit, and it's worth mentioning because in current day with video games, there are people that want to know this sort of stuff. For me personally, it's not nearly enough to warrant not playing or not recommending this game. I loved every second of it pretty much, except maybe that 1 second. But it is fascinating how sometimes these companies just can't help themselves. But look, anyway, let's say the other 99% of the game. Excellent. I loved it so much. I feel like it's reasonable value. Again, it didn't outstay its welcome. I only really got stuck on some of the last bosses and they really made me grind a bit, but it felt rewarding as opposed to frustrating. And again, there's so much content to go back and revisit, and I might well do that depending on my schedule. Anyway, look, apologies if this isn't as tight as it usually is. I've been on a little hiatus from making videos, and then I got sick literally in the last couple of days, so I'm feeling awful, but I've made it this far. And also, I probably don't have my patter because I haven't done a review like this in a while. Stick around if you like this sort of stuff, because I want to keep doing this, and, you know, we'll brush on the format, which I flip-flop on constantly. I've got a few ideas for some new video types, but you'll see as we flesh it out. And if you want to be part of that discussion, you can always join the Discord and have a chat. Anyway, let's not waffle any more than we have. Team, I might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.